7-year-old Evan Porter had already tried mouthing the words to 6 different adults that day, but it wasn't until a leather-vested biker near the cart return locked eyes with him that someone finally understood what he was trying to say. And those 4 silent words, "He's not my dad," would turn an ordinary Saturday afternoon in Bozeman into a blocked parking lot exit, a desperate attempt to flee over a curb, and the unraveling of a 2-day disappearance that had left a mother in. Spoken, barely breathing from fear. The lot outside Bridger Market was packed with the kind of everyday busyness that makes people invisible to one another. Engines rumbling, grocery carts rattling, college students from Montana State laughing as they loaded snacks into trunks, families juggling toddlers and receipt slips. No one expecting that danger could be standing 3 feet away wearing mirrored sunglasses and a calm expression. And Caleb Stone Maddox was doing what he always did on Saturdays when his pickup was in the shop, strapping grocery bags onto the back of his matte black Harley, the patches on his High Plains Brotherhood MC vest catching the sun, his broad frame casting a long shadow across the pavement. When something tugged at instincts he'd spent 22 years sharpening with the Montana Highway Patrol, instincts that never quite retired even after he turned in his badge. It was the pair walking toward a dark blue SUV with Idaho plates that caught his peripheral attention. A man in his late 30s with a firm grip on a small boy's shoulder, steering him not roughly enough to draw a scene, but tightly enough to say this wasn't casual. And the boy didn't match the man in ways that were hard to articulate, but impossible to ignore. The man clean-cut, pressed jeans, polished boots, confident stride, while the child wore an oversized gray hoodie despite the heat. Thin legs paled beneath basketball shorts that looked slept in, slip-on shoes, without socks, and hair that hadn't seen a comb in days. But mismatched clothing wasn't what tightened Stone's jaw. It was the boy's posture, stiff and watchful, head turning in quick, subtle scans like prey tracking exits. And Stone knew that look because he'd seen it in rest areas, bus depots, gas stations off lonely highways, children too quiet, too obedient, eyes too big for their faces. The man popped the SUV's rear hatch and began loading groceries with mechanical efficiency while the boy stood beside him, hands at his sides, not fidgeting, not whining, not acting like a child who'd just endured a long shopping trip. And instead of looking at candy racks or passing dogs, the boy looked at people, one by one, like he was trying to memorize faces, searching for one that might understand him, and his gaze swept across the lot, over a minivan full of distracted parents, past 2 teenagers glued to their phones, over an elderly couple arguing gently about receipts. And then it landed on Stone, who felt the moment the way you feel a change in weather before clouds roll in. 3 seconds of eye contact stretched long, the boy's chin lifting slightly as if making a decision, and then his lips moved slowly, carefully exaggerated, no sound crossing the noise of engines and chatter, but clear enough for anyone truly watching. "He's not my dad." And Stone's stomach dropped, because there are certain phrases that burn through noise and doubt like a flare in the dark. Phrases that don't belong to tantrums or custody squabbles. Phrases that belong to fear, and the boy mouthed it again, slower this time, making sure, eyes pleading for comprehension, and Stone felt the old pulse of training kick in, cataloging details automatically. Idaho plates, partial number ending in 7KX, male driver approximately 6 feet, ball cap navy, right forearm tattoo visible when he lifted grocery bags, child approximately 7. Brown hair, underweight build, and then the man's hand tightened, fingers digging into the boy's shoulder as he muttered something too low to hear but sharp enough to change the air, and the rear passenger door opened, the boy climbing inside without resistance. Not the way a kid avoids a car seat on a hot day, but the way someone complies to avoid worse consequences. And that compliance told Stone more than any shouted accusation could have. The hatch slammed shut, the driver's door opened, and the SUV engine roared to life. Reverse lights flickering briefly as if the man were calculating angles, and in that split second Stone weighed 2 possibilities the way he'd done hundreds of times before. 1, he was wrong and about to make a spectacle of himself in a crowded lot. Or 2, he was right and seconds away from letting a child vanish down Highway 86. And some decisions don't give you time for comfort. They only give you time for action. So Stone swung his leg over the Harley, ignition roaring beneath him, the vibrations steady and grounding. and he didn't speed toward the SUV, didn't confront the driver with shouts or accusations that might escalate unpredictably. Instead, he rode calmly, deliberately, straight toward the only exit the parking lot offered, a single-lane funnel bordered by concrete medians and metal railings that fed onto North 19th Avenue, and he positioned the bike sideways across the lane, cutting the engine and planting both boots on the asphalt, a 6-foot, leather-clad barrier of steel and resolve. And when the dark blue SUV rolled toward the exit and slowed to a stop 10 feet from his front tire, Stone could see the driver's eyes behind mirrored lenses assessing the situation, annoyance flickering first, then calculation, then something sharper when he noticed the phone in Stone's hand already dialing, and around them the ordinary rhythm of the parking lot continued for a breath longer, people unaware that a silent plea had just altered the trajectory of their afternoon, unaware that a child in the back seat of that SUV had finally found someone who was paying attention. And as the driver leaned on the horn once, twice, long and insistent, Stone didn't move, because sometimes the smallest act of defiance, a motorcycle blocking an exit, is the thin line between a child going home and a child disappearing into another state. And in that suspended moment, before sirens and before pursuit, everything hinged on whether instinct would prove right or wrong. The horn blared again, sharp and impatient, but Caleb Stone, Maddox, didn't move his Harley an inch, just held his phone to his ear and kept his eyes locked on the driver behind the windshield as he gave the dispatcher his name, his former Montana Highway Patrol badge number, and a clear description of the dark blue SUV with Idaho plates, explaining that a young boy inside had silently mouthed, "He's not my dad." And within seconds the irritation on the driver's face shifted into something colder as the SUV suddenly jerked into reverse, tires squealing while it shot diagonally across the parking lot. "Units are en route. Stay on the line," the dispatcher instructed, and Stone restarted the Harley, pivoting smoothly to maintain visual contact without escalating the situation, watching as the SUV barreled toward the far edge of the lot where a low concrete berm separated pavement from the side street. And instead of slowing, the driver gunned it, smashing over the curb in a spray of gravel and scraping metal before fishtailing onto the road. "He just jumped the perimeter onto Oak," Stone reported calmly, adrenaline sharp but controlled as he exited properly and followed at a calculated distance, never losing sight of the vehicle while calling out cross streets and direction of travel. The SUV accelerating toward Highway 86 in what was clearly an attempt to reach open road, and Stone knew that once the interstate was in play, the odds would change fast, flashing red and blue lights suddenly appeared ahead as two Bozeman patrol cars swung into position with practiced precision, blocking lanes before the SUV could reach the on-ramp, and the driver hesitated, swerved, then found himself boxed in from the front and rear, forced to a stop in the center lane as officers exited with weapons drawn. Stone slowed his bike well back from the scene, engine idling, hands visible, watching as the driver stepped out with raised hands, anger etched across his face, while another officer moved quickly to the rear passenger door and opened it, kneeling to the small boy's level. Even from a distance, Stone could hear the trembling voice when the officer asked his name. "Evan," followed by the words that confirmed everything. "I don't know him. My mom's in Spokane." And the air seemed to shift as radios crackled, handcuffs clicked into place, and the driver's protest dissolved into the background. Detective Laura Kim arrived moments later, approaching Stone with a focused expression, confirming that Evan Porter had been reported missing 2 days earlier out of Washington state, and that the suspect was under investigation in connection with prior misconduct. And Stone felt the weight of how close that SUV had come to reaching the highway ramp. Paramedics checked Evan for injuries while an officer wrapped a light blanket around his shoulders. And when the boy looked up and spotted Stone across the line of patrol cars, there was recognition in his eyes. Not panic anymore, but relief. And Stone gave him a small, steady nod. Because sometimes the difference between disappearance and rescue is nothing more dramatic than refusing to move out of the way when something feels wrong. By the time Caleb Stone Maddox finished giving his formal statement at the Bozeman Police Department, the adrenaline had drained from his system, leaving behind the heavy awareness of how narrowly the afternoon could have ended differently. And he was preparing to slip out quietly when Detective Laura Kim returned to the interview room with a softer expression than before and said, Evan asked if he could see you, a request that caught Stone off guard because he hadn't done what he did for recognition, but he nodded anyway, clearing his throat as they led the small boy inside. Evan looked smaller now without the oversized hoodie, dressed in a clean department-issued t-shirt and sneakers someone had found in evidence storage, his hair combed back, but his eyes still carrying the shadow of the last 48 hours. And he stood there for a second before stepping forward and saying in a quiet, steady voice, "You saw me." And Stone crouched down to his level, resting his forearms on his knees the way he used to when interviewing frightened kids on the job, and replied gently, "Yeah, buddy, I saw you." And Evan swallowed hard before admitting, "I tried telling other people. At the gas station yesterday, and in the store today, but they didn't understand." And the words hit harder than the chase had, because they weren't about sirens or blocked exits. They were about how easy it is to miss someone asking for help. And Stone shook his head slightly and said, "You did everything right. You kept trying. That's brave." And for the first time since the parking lot, a faint flicker of relief crossed the boy's face. For hours later, the front doors of the station burst open and a woman rushed inside, breathless from travel, eyes wild with hope and fear. And when she saw Evan sitting in the waiting area, she let out a sound that broke something open in everyone who heard it. Dropping to her knees and wrapping her arms around him so tightly, it was as if she could fuse him back into herself, tears soaking into his hair while he clung to her just as fiercely, repeating, "Mom, Mom, Mom." Like he needed to confirm she was real, and officers nearby turned away respectfully, because reunions like that don't leave anyone untouched. When she finally stood, still holding her son's hand, she asked through trembling breaths, "Who stopped him?" And Detective Kim gestured toward Stone, who suddenly felt far less imposing than he ever had on a traffic stop. And the woman crossed the room and gripped his hands with both of hers, saying, "They told me you blocked the exit. You chased him. You kept him from getting on the highway." And Stone shook his head gently and answered, "Your son saved himself. I just paid attention." But she insisted, voice breaking, "No, you listened." And there was a difference between those two things that lingered in the air. Before leaving for Spokane that night, Evan tugged on Stone's vest and asked if he could see the motorcycle. And outside, under the amber glow of the station lights, Stone lifted him carefully onto the Harley seat, while his mother watched with a protective hand hovering nearby. And for the first time all day, Evan smiled without hesitation, small hands gripping the handlebars as if testing something steady and solid. And he said, "When I grow up, I want to help people like that." And Stone gave a quiet chuckle and replied, "That's a good plan." But later, long after they drove away, it wasn't the chase or the flashing lights that stayed with him. It was the image of a child in a crowded parking lot silently forming words and hoping someone, anyone, would care enough to notice. In the weeks that followed, the High Plains Brotherhood MC launched a community awareness effort they called Eyes Forward, posting workshops at schools and local events about recognizing distress signals, trusting instinct, and reporting concerns without hesitation. Because Stone knew firsthand that predators depend on hesitation and doubt. They depend on bystanders convincing themselves it's none of their business, and he refused to let that be the default in his town. Months later, a handwritten card arrived from Spokane with uneven letters across the front that read, "Thank you for seeing me." And inside was a photo of Evan standing in front of his elementary school, backpack slung over one shoulder, smiling wide in a way that reached his eyes this time. And Stone pinned that photo on the bulletin board inside the clubhouse as a quiet reminder that heroism doesn't always look like dramatic rescues or headlines. Sometimes it looks like a motorcycle turned sideways across an exit, a phone call made without hesitation, and one person choosing not to look away when something feels wrong. Because the truth is, the world is full of moments where someone is silently asking for help. And the only question that really matters is whether anyone is paying attention.